Hey team, Bex Smith back here again for one of our awesome At a Football virtual events. Fabulous to have you all here. Today's event is all things NWSL. We'll be discussing key topics, things to watch for in the up and coming season. We're going to cover teams, players, coaches, all the way to the league as a whole. And this is going to be your guide to help kick off the season. And who better to lead this discussion than our two incredibly knowledgeable guests about all things American soccer. Jeff Kassouf, founder of The Equalizer, and you obviously already know him as host of At a Football's The Scoop. And Lori Lindsey, former U.S. Women's National Team player, current NWSL broadcaster. And you've definitely caught them both on At a Football. How are you guys doing?
Doing well. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, great. I'm excited to be here and talk about the NWSL.
Nice. All right, so let's get into it then. Since last season, how are we thinking? Preseason, how's it been kicked off? How's it going based on what we've been seeing and hearing?
Yeah, this really snuck up on us, I think, Lori. Like we've been talking about CBAs and everything all off season, and we're a couple days from the Challenge Cup now.
Yeah, I think, really, Jeff, that is the $1 million question. What is this season going to look like? I think last year coming in, there was a lot of known variables, coaches, players, familiarity. And then now, a lot of new coaches, two new teams that we'll talk about in this just a bit. But I think there's a lot of unknowns. So it makes for what could possibly be a very exciting season.
Expansion teams, new teams, West Coast, here you are, right? I mean, I'm super stoked coming from LA. It used to be the LA Soul back in the day.
Wow,
No one even remembers that team, right?
Oh, I should have brought my LA Soul jersey for this one. I didn't know you were going to name drop.
Absolutely. Give it to me. What are they about? Are they going to be good? Are they going to be, blown out of the water? They're obviously West Coast. They've had a little bit more sunshine in the preseason. Talk to me.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, I'm going to jump in and just go first because this is what I always do to you. Just jump right in and cut you off most of the time. But we're talking about LA, Angel City. That is the team that I have my eye on. I think it'll be interesting with both of these teams, though, because I think when you think about expansion teams, there's a lot of variables that come into play in terms of will they be successful? How is that going to be? And, when I was thinking about not only Angel City, but San Diego Wave as well, I was looking at the MLS and what teams have been successful, in particular LAFC, Atlanta. When they first came in, they were successful. They had their coaches, they had quality player selection, and like a really clear game plan. And, while we see some pieces to both of these teams with Angel City and San Diego, I think, depth in particular is a question mark for Angel City. Obviously, they brought in Sarah Gordon from Chicago. We recently found out that she tore her ACL, so that's a huge missing piece in the back line for them. So pace in the back line, depth across the board. You have Paige Nielsen coming over from Washington Spirit. And then you have some players in the midfield, Savannah McCaskill, Danny Weatherholt, Carrie Riccaro as well, that will round out that midfield. But I'm just not convinced yet that they have some true world beaters that are going to really solidify, allow this team to be off and running right from the get-go outside of their big player who they built the team around, which is Kristen Press. So I think depth, pace in the back line is an issue. However, Freya Coombe has been in the league, their coach. So there is some understanding, and they brought in some other pieces with that will add to the experience in this league. I just don't know if they have enough.
Well, and Lori, that doesn't even mention, the mystery around Julie Ertz, which obviously they thought when they made that trade that they were going to have a cornerstone piece like with Kristen Press, but farther back on the field. And we just don't know what she's going to be doing this season. It doesn't sound like they're not planning to have her. So that's a key component missing. And when you talk about Sarah Gordon now missing potentially the season or at least extended amount of time, a lot of question marks in the back, like you said. I think flip side in San Diego, you have plenty of answers in the back. Casey Stoney, former defender, she's built this team. I mean, there was a running joke that she had about 20 defenders and nobody else at one point. She's got quality defenders, Abby Dahlkemper, Naomi Gurma first in the draft. And, on the outsides, you've got Tegan McGrady for some quality. Kaylin Sheridan in net. So you've got quality in the back. You have the quality up front, like LA, building around star power up front with Kristen Press. In San Diego, you've got Alex Morgan. You've got Sophia Jakobsen coming in. She's not in camp yet or is just getting in with some visa issues. But I think you have quality at the back. You have obviously some headliners up front. And the question mark has been in the midfield. I asked Casey Stoney about this in the most recent week. And I think that she is seeing some things in camp that's a little bit creative. She's talked about Kelsey Turnbow, who's come out of college as this goal scorer. She's talked about her as a midfielder, I would presume as a number 10. She's high on Emily Van Egmond. We think Taylor Korniak might be playing in a number 6 role. And she even talked about Kristen McNabb, a defender in the midfield. So I don't know, that almost gives up a vibe of maybe with that personnel, a double pivot. I mean, we'll see, but on a high level, the question mark in San Diego is in that midfield. But I do think Casey Stoney experienced building a team from scratch with Manchester United. So she's done this to a degree. And I think same thing with San Diego. You wonder a little bit about depth, at least in that middle of the park. But, both of these teams, I think we should say right out the gate, expansion teams in NWSL have always struggled. We saw that last year with Louisville. We've seen it with Houston, Orlando. I think at least early days on paper, these are two teams that will be more competitive than we've ever seen for teams starting from scratch. And they've done that by building their rosters different ways, leveraging the expansion draft, basically saying, forget about it, and using that as leverage to make trades to get players they really wanted. So I think these will be better expansion teams than we're used to. The question is going to be, how competitive are they going to sneak into those 6 playoff spots?
Yeah, fair points across the board. And that comes into player selection, right? And then how do they utilize it depending on the formation that they're going to play.
Nice. And you both mentioned the coaches, which is obviously going to be a key piece this season. And only one of the 12 teams returns its coach from the start of last season. That's crazy. So it's like, that's a
Wild.
whole new team. If you're looking at, the 12 players or the 12 coaches that are going to be coaching this league, is that going to foreshadow success? Are there going to be potential problems? It's mad.
Well, I think we were mentioning that there's 2 expansion teams on the West Coast, but in reality, I think everybody's expansion team, it seems like, outside of Houston, because James Clarkson's the only one that has been there since for the entirety of last season. I think there's still, again, because the general theme is the unknowns for a lot of these teams. I think we've seen a lot of movement, not only with coaches, but we've seen a lot of movement with players as well. So what does the makeup of a lot of these teams look like? Jeff and I have talked extensively offline about Washington Spirit potentially being one of those teams that are like pretty solidified in terms of where they are, but everybody else, there could be a completely different look. I'm personally interested in KC Current. Matt Potter coming in as a new coach, was a former U23 women's national team coach in the U.S. And they've got players like Lynn Williams from North Carolina, Sam Mewis from North Carolina. They already had Kristen Hamilton. Who else did they have? They have AD Franch. So this is a team that were, I'm just going to say it, not good last year at all. They could not, and they had a ton of injuries. They could not get it together. They knew that. It was a difficult transition from the year before, coming over from Utah. So, but with Hugh Williams now is, kind of overseeing as like a sporting director, really had a clear picture of what he wanted to do for this team coming in. And I think it's made it easier transition for Matt Potter to come in. Ellen Mazur, former player, is his assistant coach. So this is a team that I think will come in and have like a real clear picture of how they want to play, aggressive style, possession oriented. But now you have players that can actually get the job done on the field. You're not relying on some of the younger players. You have experience in every single line.
Yeah, I think Kansas City is really interesting, Lori. Sam Mewis addition. She's still sort of coming back. She did play in the most recent preseason match, so coming back from injury. Lynn Williams have a lot of pressure on her there, but I agree. I think there's a lot of intrigue in Kansas City, and honestly, Matt Potter, U23 experience, but a little bit unknown at this level. So we'll see what that actually looks like. And how organized they are and how they play. I'm really interested. I mean, there's so many subplots, as Beck said. I think we have some college coaches making the jump to the pros, which is really, there's always been that barrier for various reasons that we could talk all day about. But Amanda Cromwell in Orlando, Chris Petrozelli in Chicago, and a lot of moving parts in those markets too. But I think Portland for me is a real focus. And I think the Thorns are always a team to watch for one reason or another in this league. And you have Rhiannon Wilkinson coming in. really, I mean, relatively by all means, maybe Mark Parsons even younger, but a young coach in many regards, a newer coach. You know, she's got experience as an assistant at the highest levels with national teams, but this being really her first big gig. And I think that comes at a time when there's a lot happening in Portland on and off the field. Lindsey Horan departs on a loan. Crystal Dunn will miss a decent amount of the season, expecting her first child. So that midfield right away, two huge pieces that'll be missing, a couple incoming pieces that we'll talk about later in this with some internationals. But I think there's a lot of question about what does that look like? What is Wilkinson's style? How does that translate? You know, coming from the international game, coming from assistant to head coach. There's the dynamic there too of Karina LeBlanc as the GM. So, you know, they have some experience together as Canadian teammates. So I think that there's a lot of potential there. There's also a lot of mystery in a way, because we just haven't really seen what Wilkinson wants to do. We haven't even seen, they always host this big preseason tournament, and they decided purposely not to stream it this time. So we're going off like paper notes of what their formation setup has looked like so far. So really interested to see what they look like. And we'll be seeing them in that Western pod with these two expansion teams and OL Reign in this Challenge Cup. So I think the Thorns, you know, always a team to watch. And in this regard, they've had so much consistency with both the roster and Mark Parsons being there for half a decade almost, that this is a real moment of transition for, you know, arguably the league's most high profile team.
Yeah, so interesting you mentioned Rhiannon Wilkinson, because she kind of reminds me of Bev Priestman when you look at sort of the transition and the progression as a coach, who obviously has done very well for the Canadian women's national team, winning the Olympics recently. Those Canadians, huh? Hey? You love talking about them, don't you, Lori?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, fab. No, really, really good. Thanks for all the info about the coaches. Back to players. So I think there's one duo that everybody seems to be talking about. Maybe it's just the ones that I hear, but Trinity Rodman, Ashley Sanchez. Are they actually the premier dynamic duo of the NWSL? And you mentioned Washington Spirit, Lori. Is this really what they need to defend that title?
Yeah, well, yes, in all accounts, I would say. I think this is a really dynamic duo, should we say, in the attack for the Spirit. And in terms of the Spirit in general, I do very much believe, and I said this when it was the expansion draft time back in December, and in the college draft when those were back to back, that this is a team that could run the table if set up properly for years to come, because it's a young team. They have some players coming back from injury as well that I think will bolster the depth of the team. And you know, there was already a really good core group, and then just a little few tweaks that they made at the end of the season, from the middle to the end of the season when Chris Ward took over as their head coach, that I think allowed these two particular players, Sanchez and Trinity Rodman, to really kind of highlight their quality on the field. And I know that Jeff is going to talk about Trinity Rodman, but Sanchez, for me, I think, you know, could actually be more of the important role here than Trinity Rodman. And it's not that comparing these two, I mean, very different players, and Trinity Rodman has clearly shown us that her ceiling is incredibly high, and there's a lot more to come here. But because of that, I think Sanchez could be more important, because all eyes are going to be on Trinity Rodman. And Sanchez, I don't think we've seen exactly all that she is capable of doing at this level. She's recently got called into some of the national team, She Believes Cup, got some national team experience, which I think is incredibly important from a young player to just kind of get that feel of what it's like to play at the international level. Very different than NWSL, very different than club level, and just the smallest details. I think she'll bring that back to her game. I talked with Chris Ward earlier this week about the importance of her. And she only had 5 goals last year, and she creates a ton. So I think there's still more room for her to be even more impactful for this team in terms of assists, in terms of going forward. And last point I'll make is, you know, with this Washington Spirit team, one of the things that they did differently at the end of the year was press a little bit higher, become a little bit more physically imposing, that allowed them to be more aggressive going forward. And they were a little bit more direct. Before, it was very possession oriented under the previous coach. And so that bodes well for Sanchez going forward, to be able to get in between the lines, create, get into goal scoring opportunities, but be able to play that final pass as well. So I think she'll be extremely important going forward.
Yeah, Lori, I got to say something controversial. I think maybe to the other coaches, this is the only team I look at and say this is a bona fide contender
Yep.
before day one, right?
Yeah.
I just don't see. I think there are a lot of questions on other teams. Now, I don't think this is North Carolina 2018 where they run away with it and nobody gets close to them, right? But this is Trinity Rodman, the first $1 million player in NWSL. I think there's a reason for that. I mean, I said in January, I think it's not a stretch to think she could be the MVP after winning Rookie of the Year last year. And there's even some precedent for that with what Lynn Williams did year one and year two for the Flash. So, and I think the ceiling on Trinity Rodman, like you said, very high. Rodman and Sanchez together, I think, Bex, to answer you, that is the premier duo right now in this league. And I think the Spirit are really smart. Rodman on a 4-year deal starting this year. Sanchez is locked in longer term. Who knows what could happen long term, but this is, a challenge in this league is keeping talent like this together. We've always seen so much turnover. And here you have, I think, if I'm lining up on a back line, these are the two in tandem that I don't want to see. And they're in Washington for the relative long haul. So I think the Spirit are the team to beat in the sense that they return everybody for the most part, like Lori said. And there's so many questions around everybody else that I think Washington, I look at, and they're in this category of their own for me.
Yeah, and one last thing to that too is why that's so important, not in a general season as well with the length of the season, but also with World Cup qualifying, going to be losing some players for all of these teams, and the Washington Spirit will get hit hard in that regard. But with the depth that they have, the players that they've brought in as well through the college draft, I think still very promising coming into 2022.
So exciting. I can't wait to watch them. I just hope the draft doesn't split them apart again, as you said, because it's one of those rare leagues, isn't it, that has the draft. So that is a possibility. But you guys mentioned, both of you have mentioned North Carolina Courage. Jeff, you just said, it's not like a season where they just run away with it because they were so good. If you tuned out and tuned back in now, you'll find a completely different North Carolina team. So we did obviously a spotlight on them last season, which was fantastic. But it was, Kari Rocario and Jess McDonald and where are those guys now? So totally unrecognizable. Are they still the best team in the world, potentially? Can they compete? How are they rebuilding? Give us what's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, I mean, a hard no to the first, and that's with all respect. But can they compete? I think that's the interesting question. And I mean, can they? Yes. I think the interesting thing here, Sean Nahas, who's the new full-time head coach, was interim at the end of last year. I found it. He's been very hesitant to use the word rebuild or even refuted the use of that word. I'm going to keep using it. They're in rebuild mode. They are a lot of talent turnover. That started a year or two ago. Crystal Dunn, Abby Dahlkemper. Now you've seen Lynn Williams and Sam Mewis make their way to Kansas City. So the core of this team that was, I would say very definitively, the best team in the world for a stretch, 18, maybe into 2019 as well. The core of that team is essentially gone outside of Dabinia, who I do think, is still in that category of among the best players in the world. But we saw last year in those absences, she's not positioned to do that alone and to carry a team alone. Maybe in a way that some others, even a predecessor to Marta, Marta's kind of done that or been asked to do that too much in the past. I don't think Dabinia necessarily that's her game, as talented as she is. So she needs some of that support around her. So question marks for North Carolina is just a straight talent swap and what that looks like. Caroline is a player who's come in or will be coming in, a fellow Brazilian. There are some pieces that will be replaced. Can you replace Sam Mewis? Can you replace Crystal Dunn, Abby Dahlkemper? Most of the time, the answer to that is no. But how does that going to look? Because that Courage team was also built in that box midfield, double sixes, double tens. And we saw at the end of last year, the personnel no longer matches that. So what's it going to look like even structurally, I think is a big question. I think there's a potential there to be competitive, but I think there are so many moving parts that the possibility, the percentage of success there is going to be a really tight window to make it work.
Listen, you just said, Jeff, about most of the time, can you replace those people? The answer is no, you can never replace those. We
Right.
saw that last year. I mean, they were not nearly as recognizable in terms of the way that they played. And, what's interesting is, I agree to you to an extent. Like, there is a lot of question marks. I'm not as down on them. They're certainly in a rebuild. Let's be honest. Like, whether they want to say it or not, they really are. But the thing that's this team was built on was pressure and being able
Mhm.
to relentlessly press teams, cough up the ball, score goals, and then when you have world beaters of players in the front six, I mean, they're just going to be dominant. And we haven't, with them not being able to replace a Lynn Williams, Jess McDonald, Sam Ewis, Crystal Dunn, Carrie Cario, who's now in Angel City. This team looks completely different. Yes, the back line's still intact, and you have an Abby Urseg who's going to lead them in terms of their captaincy and that back line, but unrecognizable team. And when you don't have a team that can press, then they all of a sudden have a lot of question marks defensively that they didn't have in the past. So that's what I'll be most curious about, is how they make that up in the midfield, how they make that up, who's going to score their goals, because I don't see a true goal scorer currently on this roster. And ultimately, how are they going to play? The box midfield was the consistent talking point amongst this Courage team throughout in the previous years. I'm not so sure that's their best formation going forward. So what does that look like? There's been talk about them being in that 3-5-2. Will that help? Because they do have some wing backs that could be promising getting forward. But that all relies on that midfield that we talked about being able to keep possession. And that's where they struggled last year, to be able to maintain the ball and then be able to create chances going forward.
Yeah, that's a great point. Real quick, just I spoke with a coach last year, Lori, and they said the Courage of old were so dominant and they were so good because you couldn't get to their back line. Their
Yep.
press was too good, and they started to drop that off. Then the personnel changes forced a bit more drop off, and all of a sudden, as you could get to it, you started to see that you could play with them, and that was a belief that just didn't exist in 2018, 2019. So a lot to figure out just structurally there.
Yep.
Yeah. And you guys have all mentioned, or you guys have both mentioned the internationals, right? There's a lot of talk that NWSL was losing players. You mentioned Sam Kerr and other players moving to different leagues like the FAWSL. But actually, when you look at the talent and the roster of internationals in the NWSL currently, but also the ones that have just come in, you've got Hina Sugita from Japan and Portland. I remember watching her in the under 17 in Costa Rica, under 20 in Papua New Guinea. She was head and shoulders beyond above every other player that was on the pitch. Maria Sanchez, forward for Houston Dash, Mexican women's national team player coming in. What does that mean for those teams and the league as at large? Because it has to, bring in those players to remain at the top of the global pecking order, doesn't it?
Yeah, it certainly does. And, Jeff touched on the Portland Thorns and what's that going to look like underneath Wilkinson and some of the differences that she'll bring in tactically and to the squad. But Hina Sugita is somebody, much like Bex just said, that I've had my eye on. I've called some of her games, a bright talent, just turned 25. So still a lot of upside to her career. And it's been no secret that this has been in the works for a number of years with the Portland Thorns, just for different reasons in terms of COVID, as we all know. Held up this deal getting done, and it's actually perfect timing with Lindsey Horan departing to Lyon, Crystal Dunn, as you mentioned, Angela Salem, who's retired. So this is a team with the Portland Thorns that have relied heavily on their midfield to dictate the tempo, the play, the way that they want to attack. And all of a sudden you have some holes in it. So Sugita comes at a perfect time. And this is a player, regardless if they play in that diamond midfield that we saw quite frequently under Mark Parsons, or go to a 3 midfield, which has been kind of a little bit of a topic under Wilkinson, Sugita can fit in well. Versatile, can play in the 6, can play in the 8, can play in the 10 role, has a huge engine. So more of a box-to-box midfield with the craftiness and the technical capability that we typically see from Japanese players. And I think, to this point too, why I feel Sugita will slip in seamlessly to this Portland Thorns, because they are a possession-oriented team. Even if they want to play direct at times, Sugita can play that style of football. And that has been a question mark for a lot of Japanese players to come into this league, because it typically is end-to-end, very high pace, difficult for, outside of really Kawasumi, who we've seen dominate in with the OL Reign, and then now at Gotham, even though she is an aging player, she's been able to be she's been the only lone Japanese player that I feel like has been able to be impactful. But Sugita, I feel like with her engine, not the fastest, but technically enough, is able to break lines and to be able to get up and down the field, I think could really make a statement right away.
Yeah, I mean, I think to that point too, her international teammate June Endo in LA will be one to watch. Potentially, maybe pairing off Kristen Press. We'll see how that actually looks. But yeah, I mean, Bex, you mentioned Maria Sanchez. I mean, I think there's a lot of intrigue there for me. I mean, this is a big signing in many ways, and I think for her herself, because she's very talented, I think Houston's going to need a goal scorer like her to pair off of a Rachel Daly and some of the other talent that they have. But also, this is a player who didn't quite get the shot she deserved or thought she deserved when she was in this league a few years ago. Went to Mexico, extremely successful for really the most high profile team in Mexico. And Houston had the shortest loan on the history of the earth in June with her. I think she played 3 games. And then, this deal to get her back for the full time on a more permanent deal brings in a very talented player from one of Mexico's top clubs, one of Mexico's best players. And I think it's going to be really exciting to see how she adapts now on a full-time basis, because I think, I think in the US, we don't have enough of appreciation for, at least on an individual talent level, some of the really good players that we're seeing in Mexico that are developing right in front of our eyes, and obviously everything that's happening with the crowds and some of the team development at large. And I think Sanchez is a player who very technical, is somebody who could really take this league by storm in many ways. And she's shown us glimpses of that already anyway, playing Houston in some friendlies, playing for Houston very briefly on loan. So, I think that this is not only a really big deal individually, but could open the door to some further movement between Liga MX and NWSL. And I've said this a lot. I think the NWSL needs to be keeping an eye on what's going on in Mexico. That's bringing players in. That's what's going on a business front. So I think in many ways, Sanchez represents something bigger even than herself.
Yeah, I appreciate that point too, because I think in general, just like looking at this season, there's a lot of room for these specific players, and definitely agree with you on Sanchez having the ability to kind of change the look of the NWSL a little bit, bring in some different wrinkles and style play that still fit in with some of the higher pace, the pressing style that we typically see, but then at moments be able to slow down the game. And again, just bring in different nuance to each of these teams.
So interesting. And even with all this enthusiasm for the NWSL season, we're still heading into Women's World Cup qualifiers and the Women's World Cup, obviously, next year. We're going to be missing arguably 2 of the top talented and most exciting players to watch. You both mentioned them, Lindsey Horan and Catarina Macario off in Lyon, right? I mean, don't fret. We have you covered. You can watch all of that on Active Football. But where do you think the NWSL sits now with the top leagues in the world?
Ooh, the $1 million question. This is the online
real.
debate.
It got real.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think it's among them. I mean, that's not a cop-out answer. I think, what is the best league in the world? This usually comes down to like a reframing of the question of what's the most competitive. I do think traditionally, and we saw that last year. I mean, look at the playoff race, that day in, day out, even a bottom of the table team. I mean, Laura, you mentioned Kansas City was not good last year. I mean, that's true. And you look at the table, but like that back half of the season, Kansas City wasn't a team that most people wanted to play because they started to figure it out. And they were, they sat dead last, basically start to finish. Yeah, well, the field. We won't talk about the field. Thankfully that got figured out. But like, I think, you don't show up. I mean, Sophia Jakobsen, I talked to her about this last month because she played with Bayern at that point over the summer against Louisville. And she said Louisville was better than I thought they were going to be. And I think if you're looking at it from afar, you say, here's this second bottom team. But like Louisville had enough of a grittiness, wasn't an amazing team. But I think, you do see some score lines still on kind of a weekly basis in some other leagues that it's not dismissing them, and it's not dismissing the quality at the top of them. But I think day in, day out, you do still see a competition level in the NWSL that you don't necessarily get in most leagues. I do think FAWSL is coming around on some of the mid-table, bottom-table teams. We're seeing that in results now, where I think we're seeing quote unquote upsets where, the top of the table has gotten shaken up from mid-table teams. But I think most competitive, certainly still NWSL. And that's how I'll reframe that question, Bex.
Yeah, no, it is the most, every single game is a dogfight. It is, and all the players around the league will tell you that, regardless of who you're playing. I mean, Jeff said it well in terms of Kansas City and Louisville, bottom of the table, but no one really wanted to play them. And there's still, it's a lot of factors, right? Weather, everything, the travel, all of these factors come into it. And then you have athleticism as well. You have very sound technical players, and it is a dogfight regardless of who you are playing. I mean, just 2 years ago, we saw Houston win the Challenge Cup. I mean, and they struggled to get into, they didn't get into the playoffs last year. It was a close fight. So yes, top to bottom, I would put this as the #1 league in the world still. But clearly, as you mentioned, Bex, Katarina Macario, Lindsey Horan, and Leon, I mean, there's phenomenal players across the board in this league. And it just speaks well to the growth of the game and the growth of the individual players.
We need a Club World Cup. Club World Cup.
Yeah, we do need a club.
We need a what? What? What do we need?
You heard it here first.
You heard it on Atta Football first. We need a Club World Cup. Right. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Thank you to Lori and Jeff for your incredible wisdom and insights. It's almost like this is what you do full time. I'm sure everyone is super excited to see what the season has to bring. And until next time, thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.